Okay, audio test. Audio test. Audio test. Alrighty. Welcome everybody to Game Master Soapbox. I'm Jonathan Albin, your host, also known as Game Master J or Commander Clueless, depending on where you know me from. And I've been everywhere, man, so you probably know me from a lot of different places. Today, as usual, we have our list of categories up here, and I'm going to spend about 10 minutes on each one. And as usual, I'm going to try to segment them so there'll be a few seconds of silence between them so that I can parse them later into separate sections. Today, we're going to cover the dreaded combat slog, a issue that roleplay games throughout the 48 plus years that I've been a game master that have been a problem, a challenge, a hard to deal with issue. We're also going to talk about planned encounters versus off-the-cuff play. We're going to talk about the dreaded total party kill. Ironically, right from that, we're going to go to the fine art of cliffhanging. And our rant today is going to be overdoing the memberberry moments. And finally, we will close out with additional information and a reminder to participate in the NycosRPG experiment, which will be tomorrow morning, like every Saturday morning at 10 a.m. All right. Before we get started, I want to make sure we remember and acknowledge our sponsor. The logo is right down there in the corner. Board Game Paradise is in Redlands, California, full-service game store covering everything from card games to role-playing games and everything in between. And to remind you that we do have live sessions if you want to come and participate and play at my table. We're at 6 p.m. Pacific time on Mondays and Tuesdays each week. And the Tuesday group is just now kicking off, so there's plenty of seats available for that. The Monday group at this moment is on a bit of a hold for not allowing new players, but certainly we can coordinate for that if you're going to come some distance and want to play. They are on State Street in downtown Redlands, and I highly recommend, if you are looking for a game store to cover your every need, take a look no further than Board Game Paradise in Redlands, California. Also, at this moment, I want to remind you, if you like the show and are used to watching it, make sure you got the subscribe and the follow buttons linked so that way you can be reminded every time we provide new content. And also, if you like the video in particular, make sure you like the comment. And of course, I ask that you share this with everybody you know that is involved in the RPG world, whether they be game players or game masters in their own right. This show is specifically built to embrace both sides of the table with a focus on the game master. So, alrighty. Now, as we go into each section, I do want to draw attention to that topic, so I will mention it by name before we get going. It's kind of a verbal header, if you will. So we are now going to be discussing the dreaded combat slog. It's 25 minutes into a roleplay session. The game master has done an exemplary job of setting up the scenario. The miniatures are in place. The players all have their die rolling mechanisms out, and the narrative of the description of the very first engagement is about to start. Game Master calls for a roll of initiative. Everyone makes their initiative roll. Now, for many, that one initiative die roll is all they will need for the entire conflict. This is canon for 5th edition. Previous editions required a separate initiative roll for each turn of action, which caused perhaps more of a free-for-all feel and certainly more of a dynamic action seen, but in the current iteration, the current edition of Dungeons and Dragons, there's a single die roll for everyone, and you determine your order of operations, and thereafter you just go turn over turn. Having rolled the initiative, again, first turn of the engagement, the Game Master does an exemplary job of describing each player's action in turn, making sure to include the dramatics of the fervency of the swing, perhaps the weapon that they are using, the signature opening move if they have such a thing, and it's just going along well. Everyone's got their first turn of action in sequence. You can almost feel the blood spilling across the battlefield as the engagement continues. And then as you come to the end of the first round, the Game Master says, alrighty, here we go. So round 2, what's your roll? No, that'll miss. Roll, you roll. Oh, that's a hit. Go ahead and do your damage. Okay, and you. And that continues for the next 25 minutes until the hit points of the monsters are expended out and the heroes are victorious. This longer term, and I said 20 minutes, I'm being generous. Let's say it's a 5th or 6th level adventure. The battle might take a half an hour, it might take all of the role play time you have to play. But the point is that the action after that first round, the dramatic explanation of what's happening each turn tends to become itself sort of redundant, and especially if the players are having a particularly bad night of it with the dice rolling, it might be turn after turn after turn after turn of what I commonly call the Bam Bam effect. The idea back in my day, there was a cartoon called The Flintstones. There was a character named Bam Bam, and he was a toddler, but he had a mighty swing, and he would just beat up things by just hitting them with his stick over and over and over again. The combat slog, this term that I'm referring to, describes the seemingly inane process of elimination of one or more parties in a conflict by the whittling down of their hit points by a series of attacks leveled at them by the players, wherein the mechanical portion of the game has now taken over and the reality of the fight scene has gone out the window, and we are simply running through the mathematics of how many turns it takes to eliminate the villain. This dreaded combat slog has been there for as long as a role-playing game has been above 3rd level. Going all the way back to the beginning, every edition has a similar circumstance. In early versions, the books described each combat round as a series of swings and feints and such, so that the die roll represented only the 1 or 2 accurate pinpointing swings that occurred in that conflict. Nonetheless, regardless of what the rulebook said, the players have always considered their roll with the dice to be their actual swing with the weapon. And when there was a confluence, when there was a change up, turn over turn, and round after round, as you rolled through the chaos of determining whose initiative is next and whether or not the modifier for being a reach weapon applied back then, or whether you actually got an extra attack in because you were firing a ranged weapon or whatever, these little nuances caused the conflict or the battle to feel as if it was ongoing, that it was a passage of time wherein the order of things would become random and distorted, and there was really no clear idea of how much time each action took. So it felt more like a conflict. Now, granted, the dice rolling mechanism has fundamentally been the same forever, and that is you roll your attack roll, modify it by the defense of the target you're aiming at and determine a success failure based on that numerical value. And throughout all that time, the attack roll has had a threshold. The threshold moves up and down based on the defense of the opponent, his relative speed, his accuracy, and things like that in terms of his ability to move with his armor on, etc. And so it has been a bam bam game for ever so long. Now, in a future video, I will talk about the history of role-play games, and in particular the history of Dungeons and Dragons combat and where that stems. But just suffice it to say that the combat slog has been with us since the first editions. It just was able to be perhaps concealed better by other die mechanisms, other specific things, such as for a while they included the speed factor of a weapon. They considered the length of the weapon. They considered the heft, the wield ability, how much of it was improvised weaponry, etc., etc., etc. They had all these different things that would try to cloud and confound it so that it felt more dynamic, but it has always been hit the monster, take away its hit points. Is it still alive? Yes, do it again. Wash, rinse, repeat. And the biggest challenge to a combat slog is that it completely erases the dynamics of the conflict. I'm here to tell you that one of the primary reasons why the NycosRPG process is, I believe, going to replace standard die rolling is that you're going to be able to tangibly see the success or fail of a round or a battle in a matter of moments compared to the long overdue change out of the combat slog. And the way that is manifested is that die rolls will become relativistic. If you saw yesterday's video, I did a section on the, actually it wasn't yesterday's video, previous video I did on quantum die rolling. This is the concept that the roll that you make with your die doesn't just generate a single success or failure response. I mean, it doesn't just create just the two responses, but theoretically it can produce up to 5 separate results from a single die roll, and therefore be able to give you a graduated relevancy, a relative nature between two players' actions to see whether a person perfectly executed his attack plan or whether he did so at a partially successful level, or whether he was wildly successful or had, just like in golf, had that perfect swing. So the idea of having multiple responses from the die roll will resolve the combat slog, but we needed to talk about how the combat slog came to be. And the short version is that the combat slog is created by the concept of an artificially defined set of points to be eliminated in the conflict. Most of these games refer to it as hit points. They might call them life points. They may call them life itself. It depends on the mechanism. But the idea is that you have a pool of points that must be scaled off before a player is eliminated from a conflict. And this leads to the combat slog, because the greater and the higher level and the more successful a player character is in a combat environment, the less likely they are to lose their own hit points, and the more likely they are that they're going to be taking hit points away from the opponent. But likewise, as the player advances, so do the monsters, and the monster difficulties increase, and the amount of damage that can be done to them is mitigated by their armor or special effects or limitations, resistances, immunities, and that kind of thing. So that it fundamentally leaves the combat slog stasis in the system, and over time that stasis period seems to get longer and become more uncomfortable and less visually or even intellectually enjoyable. So the reason why I mentioned the slog is that we need to find a way to avoid that, and the NycosRPG mechanism will do that. The second thing about the combat slog that is particularly annoying is that inevitably the combat slog will always result in levels of frustration and angst when the players realize either that the monster is regenerating some of those hit points and therefore making the slog even longer, or the damage they've been doing has been being mitigated by resistances or special armor or special considerations that the game master has put into place for that monster. And all of these things lead to a combat that becomes unplayable and not fun at all. So what the NycosRPG system does is it creates a relativistic comparison between the die roll of the attacking player with all of his training and skills, generates a number that shows his relative success, and likewise the villain has a die roll and compares against his ability and comes up with a relative success or failure. The difference between them is in effect the amount of damage that can be done in terms of how much you can interfere with the other person's ability to continue. So therefore, the success failure is clearly resolved by just simply that, a success versus a failure. But the outcome from it can either be an increased amount of takeaway, in other words, the attacker's success can take away from the opponent's, but it also does something else, and that is the mechanism allows for simultaneous die rolls, so a fight scene will be more like an actual fight where all players are engaged in their actions and they determine their die rolls in terms of their relative success in comparison to with what they intended to do in the turn, and that therefore you can get instantaneous comparative results with just a glance at the dice. And there's so much more to it than that, and I don't have time at this moment, but just realize that the dreaded combat slog is eliminated when you utilize the NycosRPG quantum die rolling system. All right. Now, as a storyteller, you have a couple of options when it comes to creating the encounters you're going to play in. The first is to plan your encounters out. This means determining the specific scene, the specific setting, the climate, the theme, the props, anything that might be available for the persona, the characters in the game to pick up and use. It'll include the items and tools that the villain or at least nemesis might have to engage with, and it'll have clear definitions of the winning conditions, what it is that is intended to happen in the scene, whether or not it is supposed to be played out to the death, whether it's played out to the pain, to the blood, whatever the mechanism is for determining success failure is already built into the encounter. This is held, therefore, in stark contrast to the off-the-cuff story, wherein the game master literally is playing off of what the players have asked for, looking at the scene from the standpoint of what could be added instantaneously, what kind of experiential tools should be allowable within the framework, and the monsters are completely created arbitrarily. Now, I'm going to go explain a little bit of that, but the idea is the off-the-cuff encounter is one that is not specifically written down. The players and the game master are synchronizing in the scene to create a story that both of them have some input into, and the game master is not working off of a pre-planned sheet, pre-planned encounter schedule, list of the abilities and such. Which one's better is the obvious question, and the correct answer is yes, they are both better than the other in given circumstances. The planned encounter has some serious benefits. You know what's going to be there in essence, you can determine how much time is going to be spent in the engagement by knowing to what length the villains will press the issue before they retire. You have an idea of how long the players have to complete the mission before, say, Nemesis reinforcements show up. You have a better understanding of the environment, what kind of parameters in terms of footing and difficult terrain, everything is taken care of in a planned encounter. An off-the-cuff game can definitely feel more impulsive, and if done properly, it'll have every bit as much drama and excitement as a planned encounter, maybe even more, since it would seem that even the storyteller is not sure where it's going. But there also would be a challenge that if it's done improperly, or it's done without a clear understanding of the character balance, which I've covered in a previous issue, if you don't have a clear understanding of that, then it will either feel, on one hand, contrived and too easy, or it'll be seen as sort of railroadish and clunky because the difficulty level isn't matched evenly. With those many years of experiences I have, I've obviously run both the planned encounters and the off-the-cuff. I have to honestly say that, there I go with that honestly again. I keep using that word. It doesn't matter. The off-the-cuff becomes easier over time because you simply have seen more experiences. It's really no different than playing in a card game where you get used to the numeric values of the cards and what the likelihood of getting a good hand versus a bad hand is. When you are playing in an off-the-cuff encounter, the biggest challenge is realizing that the players may hold you accountable for what is in the scene. So you may have described utilizing a particular dragon and let slip his age and size, and suddenly the players are already calculating, well, this one of this size and type can't be that far from its lair, so there must be this amount of boxes of treasure just laying around waiting for us. So just realize that the off-the-cuff does carry with it a bit of a burden for accountability and reality in the overall scene. In terms of playability, a planned encounter, of course, is going to be easier. In many cases, the villains will have a defined spell list and even an order in which they will be activating them, so that it's less brain power from the storyteller. Whereas if it's an off-the-cuff situation and you have a villain who happens to be a spellcaster, now you've either got to have the entire spell list memorized or be lightning quick on looking stuff up. So one thing to recommend is to have a quick list of potential spells based on the classification you're using. Now, again, in the case of the NycosRPG, since there are no restrictions in terms of character class and race and abilities, perhaps you have never used any spellcasting, but you want to depend on a random act of such to be a trigger in your encounter. If the game master's off the cuff has opened it up for that opportunity, then certainly it's up to that game master to also be prepared to handle what those possibilities might be, and to be able to come up with the static die rolls for the player to accomplish the tasks at hand. Planned encounters also tend to give a break-off point or a place wherein the storyteller is kind of held to external parameters, and even in a case where the villains have gotten the upper hand, it's up to the storyteller to keep them to task in terms of what was written to make sure that the encounter stays within the planned environment. I've often used my buddy Scott, who is a game master in his own right, as an exemplar, and in his case, his play style is much more accommodating to the planned encounter than mine, and so sometimes he gets frustrated when he watches me do storytelling because he thinks that I do it so fluidly and smoothly and effortlessly that he thinks that somehow there's some magic trick, no pun intended, some mythical way to determine the right level of balance in an off-the-cuff encounter. And the reality is simply that you play through enough different alternatives, you have a feel for it. It's also important to learn certain other skills such as hit point tracking if you're using a classic RPG. The combat slog becomes sort of your friend because you are fundamentally required both for the players and the monsters to track the overall hit points and be aware of where the attackers and the adversaries are in comparison with one another on an ongoing basis. But for my effort, for the number of years that I've played, I have to say that off the cuff is far more the way to go. But that's simply because I've had, we are in our 9th iteration, the 9th time we've played through my story arc. And so therefore with eight 7-year campaigns, or 8 6-year campaigns behind me, that's 48 years of gameplay. And with that much experience, the scenarios, even if they were written down someplace, would be as if they were off the cuff because I'm simply drawing on memory, and a fluid memory at that. So it's a choice. It's a decision. My recommendation is for newer game masters. If you're, say, under 3 or 4 years of experience, by all means, purchase and utilize planned encounters, the Dungeons and Dragons system books that have the particular adventure lined out from levels 1 through 20 or whatever are perfectly fine for this kind of play because they have everything you need in a single volume, and you can expand or reduce the effects in keeping with the players that you have. So highly recommend planned encounters, especially for early players. If you have a extended play repertoire, then I would expect more of your adventures to be off the cuff. And I would even go so far to say that if you have more than, say, 6 to 10 years of role play experience, you might want to at least give an off the cuff game encounter, even if it's a single encounter, give it a shot and see how well you do for yourself, how it feels to do it, because there is such liberty when you're no longer bound to what somebody else wrote, and you'll feel more in control of the world that you're creating when the creation process actually stems from your own decisions. The next point is one of those touchy areas which every game master at some point will come upon. And generally speaking, your first total party kill will happen by accident. And by total party kill here, I'm specifically describing an encounter or a series of encounters that by the end of it leaves no players in agency on the board. Every person in the party has met their demise or is in some other way wholly incapacitated. The first time it happens to you, it is a shock because you really never intend for this to happen. If you are the kind of game master who sets up a scenario specifically to eliminate every party member, you're doing it wrong. The party's purpose in the game is to learn from and advance their character development through the paces of a dangerous and exciting lifespan. It is not to play their character for two or three episodes, and then find themselves having to recreate a new character. Now, I do need to clarify this is different from the random death scene that will also inevitably occur in your game sessions, but this in particular is a different animal. It takes a level of dedication to continue a conflict that's going to end the party. No matter how much of a rules stickler you are, looking into the eyes of your friends as their characters are dwindling away and finding no way to find respite, it takes a certain kind of a person to desire to wipe them out. Now, every game master has at different times wanted to eliminate one or more characters that's in his campaign. This can be because of player interaction. It can be because of stuff that happens off the table that you've brought in. It could be information that's in the table where your level of frustration has gotten to the point where you can't bear it any longer. But this single character elimination is a far cry from what I'm referring to here. A total party kill literally leaves the players at the table with unfinished business. Pardon me for a second. Got itchy eyes. Probably humidity, but a blast of air went through here just a minute ago and started messing with my eyes. So total party kill is a bummer, and in my long tenure as storyteller, there have been probably, well, I'm certain it's been less than a dozen total party kills in total, and the most recent one is now more than 14 years ago. And even that one still rides heavy on your heart because the players were doing everything they could to stay alive, and you were doing everything you could to make the story exciting. And those two have collided to the point where the players either failed a bunch of rolls, or you were particularly too successful, or something has happened and you've painted yourself into a corner. There are a dozen different ways I suppose you could take care of a total party kill. The first one, of course, is to say, well, that's not how that really happened. Let's erase that scene and start back at this point in the narrative and play through it again, taking into account the decisions that were made and preventing them in the redo. For most, this is an unsatisfactory way to go because they are expecting to have danger around every corner. And if you have made danger available around every corner, and this is the only time they have, pardon the phrase, screwed the pooch, so to speak, then so be it, and everybody needs to build a new character. On the other hand, there are situations where some mitigation might actually exist. In other words, the fair elimination of characters is a matter of not only player ethics, but monster ethics as well. I mean, if the villain they are playing is a sensible being, he may or may not allow them to have completely expired. If the party has been particularly good at their job and he's been particularly annoyed with them, then maybe. But generally speaking, bad guys, at least the good bad guys in movies, almost always want to gloat, always want to lord it over their heroes and not just eliminate them. So it's perfectly feasible that the characters lose the battle but don't lose the war and are still alive in some fashion. As a matter of fact, some of the best games I've ever run were those where the players were defeated and captured and had to resolve how to escape and overcome that way. So the result of a total party kill does not necessarily mean that the total party has to be eliminated, taken out of action, and prevented from continuing. The TPK is, however, indicative of a challenge that you as a storyteller have. Either the players are running risks way above their pay grade, so to speak, or you as the game master aren't creating barriers and warnings sufficient to keep them from doing so. Sometimes it's a mix of the two, sometimes it's neither, but The total party kill at any time that it occurs is a time of storyteller reflection and reconsideration, because if you become reputed for TPKs one after the other, you won't be a game master very long, because players simply won't run the risks. Now, there are some arguably berserk players who would take that as a challenge, but generally speaking, the total party kill is a wake-up call for both the players and the game master alike, that there's something in their mechanism that's not clicking specifically, and that maybe there's something that needs to be coordinated or communicated about going forward. In the 1930s and 40s, when motion pictures were starting to get going, one of the biggest challenges was they needed to find ways to ensure that their audience would come back week over week to view their films. There was heavy competition between the different box offices and movie manufacturers, and so the concept of the cliffhanger, which had been arguably created in the radio era, was basically the equivalent of a chapterization. You built up your story to the point where something dynamic was about to occur. You raise the music, raise the tension, lower the lights, cause the threat to become real, and then screen rolls up and says, "Thank you and welcome back, and come join us next week to find out what happened to Black Bart, what happened to our hero Charlie," or whatever. The art of creating a cliffhanger is a well-revered and time-honored tradition in just about every entertainment form out there. Even if you think of, for example, the Marvel superhero movies, they have now gotten to the well-defined habit of creating a snippet video to be played in the after credits that is a teaser for what is yet to come. Perhaps it's a piece of the next chapter, perhaps it's a hint at the conclusion of this one, but in any fashion, that cliffhanger entices the viewer, the participant, to come back and pick up where they left off. So too in the case of a role-playing game. If at the end of the session the monster has been nearly defeated and is on its last breath and he's about to be eliminated, that's one way to do it. Another is the idea of you vanquished the foe, you've picked up some of your loot, and suddenly you hear a sound at the doorway that suggests that something else is about to enter the room. All of these forms of cliffhanging are absolutely valid and useful. The trick on it, the part that makes it a fine art, is that if you make it so that the players spend their entire week contemplating what that cliffhanger might mean, you've done it right. I have, usually after each of my game sessions, I have a debrief period where we actually sit and chit chat and talk about the outcome of the encounter and what might have been done better, what might be coming in the future and such. And so a cliffhanger is a very sweet way of fomenting that conversation and keeping the players focused on what's coming down the pipe. This is also useful if the question is whether or not you can keep people at your games table. If you let them off the hook each session, there's at least an incremental chance that they will not come back because, well, we finished the story. By having a cliffhanger or at least some dangling information not yet resolved, then you give the players a very tangible reason to come back, join the table, and play through it. The nuance of how to do that comes from, number one, experience, number two, an awareness of the villain and the situation in which the session is found, and a pretty strong understanding of the motivation either of the villain or the upcoming one to press the issue and make it more dangerous, more exciting. So when you are going to cliffhanger, make sure you have a place where you believe the session is going to go, that you've got more details than just the cliffhanger. So the next session, when you start, it simply isn't, yeah, well, that's done, and now we start again. If you do that too often, if you don't pay off the cliffhanger with additional hooks into the next episode, you actually are undermining the very use of the cliffhanger and devaluing your session's end cycle. So make sure that you tweak and adjust this from time to time. Don't always have a heavy-handed cliffhanger. Sometimes have a nuanced one, or maybe even actually resolve from time to time with no new material out beyond it. This is particularly useful if you're going to be doing hard chapter changes where they know that the scene is going to change, and therefore the break-off is not as egregious as it is when it's arbitrary. Alrighty, I didn't speak on that as long as I thought I would, but that's okay. We're now going to get to our rant, and with the rants, I usually establish a starting time and wait until the clocks roll over to that moment before I start so that I don't go over. Originally, the rants were intended to be 1-minute segments and 9 minutes of explanation, but that has not worked. Every rant I've ever done tends to take me well into my 10-minute mark anyway, so today will be no doubt the same. So our rant today is the overdoing of member-berry moments. Okay, there was a video some time ago, and I don't even remember whose it was, but they used the phrase member-berry, and it stuck in my head. It's a reference to those moments in a game session when the players or the game master does a action or presents some evidence in a way that triggers one or more memories of the players about previous sessions and previous encounters, and even perhaps movies they've seen. Member berries are, especially if they're in-game member berries, are really useful. It is really kind of fun to have the players recall, oh, this feels just like the time when we faced the monster number X at the Town of Impossible meetings. But that triggering the member berry should be a payoff in itself and not a driving mechanism. The players want to experience the game that they are in right now. They would like for the memories of this game session to become a member berry in the future, but they don't necessarily want to have the member berry of this situation to be only a remembrance that you remembered something from a previous encounter. So holding on to the use of these narrative elements gives you the opportunity to keep the story flow in check and to keep the players' minds on what is at hand currently. My personal rant here is not necessarily about what the game master does with member berries. Of course, I'm a game master, so I'm kind of partial to us. But instead, I'm referring to the times when a player will not only remember something that happened in his character's life before that reminds him of this one, but it won't even necessarily be in the same campaign or even under the same storyteller. And that to me, that's tantamount to going over to somebody else's house for breakfast after they've invited you and everything and provided you with materials, and you pull out of your pocket your own milk container and use your own milk because it seems that you're not trusting or don't like the one that is being provided. And utilizing a member berry specifically to overcome a story point that is ongoing in the present is not only is it unfair, but it's unprofessional. It's uncharacteristically unkind, because the point of the story being told is to create these kinds of memories, and washing over a current condition with memberberry juice, where you're pulling out the stops and remembering everything that went on in that previous scenario and trying to relate it, is not only harming your interaction with the players, but it certainly is an out of character mechanism which drives the entire story off the rails, and it further spawns counter remembrances. Either, yeah, I remember a time like that too, and I did this. Or it just tends to be sort of insightful in that it says something about the player, that they can't create something new in this moment, but instead want to draw back to something that happened before. And the overdoing is the problem. Yes, once in a while, it's fine. Particularly if it's kind of a funny encounter, sure. But overdoing the memorable moments and making the remembrances of the game more critical to the story itself than what's actually going on in the scene is a disservice both to the game master, and the players themselves that are at the table. So that's all I got to say about that. Okay, so we're going to close with the NycosRPG experiment coming up tomorrow. Do remember, tomorrow at 10 a.m. we are going to be on this channel in a very similar setup. I'll have the screen set up with spaces for the character names and such, so that we can start to create the narrative. But you as the participants, you as the viewers, will have the opportunity to drive the story by giving recommendations and even input as to the direction and course of the players' lives. And I endeavor to be able to accommodate as many varied player characters as we have participants who want to play. Do remember also that the the Patreon account over at patreon.com/Nykos does give you the opportunity at the $20 value to gain access to our Discord chat channels, and you'd be able to join us on air and chat with me directly during the show by becoming a Patreon supporter at the $20 level. So if you're looking for more information about that process, you can check out patreon.com/Nykos, or the other videos that I've done under the Twitch NycosRPG experiment header. So without much else to say, I do want to say that the character sheets are available at NycosRPG.com, as is the PDF version of the NycosRPG rulebook, specifically titled Dark Shards, that it covers the fantasy setting in general and the character magic creation process in specific. So I want to thank you for your time today. If you've stayed with us through the video and you like what you see, please make sure you hit the subscribe button, or in the case of Twitch, hit the follow button so that you'll be updated every time we create new content. And also click the like, because it helps with the algorithm to get this video out to more people, because the more people we have that are learning to be game masters, the more entertaining game sessions we will have. So again, I'm Jonathan Albin, Game Master J, also known as Commander Clueless. Thanking you for your participation, and I will see you next time on a Game Master Soapbox.